Hello and welcome to Zilog and Moto. I'm your host Dave, and this is your quasi-weekly look at the English language libraries of the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega CD, and 32X. For some background from those of you that are new to the channel, about 7 years ago I walked into a Goodwill after working out at the gym next door and saw two Master System games in the glass case that they have for special items. At the time, I was pretty heavy into collecting comic books, but I was getting burnt out on trying to keep up with all of them each month. Something about seeing those two Master System games, which you don't usually see in the United States, and especially not in a thrift shop, kind of flipped a switch for me. Next thing I knew, I had dropped comic books, and I was fully into collecting any kind of game that I could plug into a Sega Genesis, either by itself or via some sort of peripheral. About that same time, I ran into a magazine called Retro Gamer in Barnes & Noble, and that particular issue happened to be doing a feature on Master of Darkness. And if you've never seen that game or are unfamiliar with it, it looks very similar to Castlevania. And I'm looking at these pictures of the game that I'd never seen before, and frankly, it looks better than Castlevania in a lot of ways, and I'm just scratching my head going, how on earth did we not get this game in the United States? It looks awesome. And as I kept reading Retro Gamer, I realized just how much of the Sega library that even if I kept collecting games locally, I would never see or experience. So I decided, let's get a little crazy here. I'm not just going to collect games that came out in the US, I've got access to the internet. I'm going to collect games from all over, and as long as I can read what's on the screen, I'm buying it. And if I'm going to go through all the trouble to seek out all these games, I'm not just going to throw them on a shelf and call it a day. I'm going to document my experience with all of them, good and bad, and share that experience with all of you. Making those decisions is how I got to reviewing this week's game, Pit Fighter for the Master System. The US got a port of Pit Fighter for the Genesis in late 1991 from Tengen, but by that time the Master System was dead and buried here, with the last American Master System game famously being the port of Sonic the Hedgehog, which had come out about a month before Pit Fighter on the Genesis. But while the Master System was dead in the United States, it was still going strong in Europe. And due to it still being a viable console platform, Domark, who had previously worked with Tengen on other releases like Rampart and Klax, decided, hey, maybe we should take a shot at this wildly popular pre-Mortal Kombat arcade game. Now, anyone that's familiar with the Genesis port of Pit Fighter, or that possibly saw my review of that game back in episode 85, knows that the Genesis version of the game isn't exactly what you would call good. And, of course, it doesn't help that the original arcade game hasn't aged well either, but the Genesis, or at least Tengen, weren't capable of creating a port that looked anywhere near as good as the arcade machine, with the result being a rental title if there ever was one. So, having said that, with the Genesis already being underpowered for Pit Fighter, what possible hope is there of the Master System version being any good? Was this potentially just a cash grab from Domark and nothing else? Well, I guess we're about to find out, but first, let's take a look at the package.
And this is my copy of Pit Fighter for the Master System. This copy is in fantastic shape on both the outside and the inside, as we'll get to in a minute. The outer case looks near perfect with no scratching or gouging in the plastic, and the hang tab is intact at the top of the case. The inner cover looks great as well, with no water damage or sun bleaching, and also no edge wear at the top and the bottom. One note here is that the original owner apparently decided to take the Sega sticker seal, which normally goes on the side of the case where it opens, and rather than fold it over like I've seen with certain other games, take it off and reapply it to the top of the box. Now, normally I hate having to deal with stickers on these cases, but with something like this, I don't mind so much, and it does add a little character to this copy. As far as the front cover goes, this is definitely a later Master System release, with it having a proper logo and cover art, and if you weren't aware of that, you could tell by the graphic down below that mentions the Master System 2. The logo is the standard Pit Fighter logo from the arcade machine, so nothing too surprising there, and the artwork is just a cropped version of the picture that was used on the Genesis cover. And I'm totally fine with that, as the photo used shows off Buzz taking on Chainman Eddie, and Ty in the background squaring off with Angel, and this shot definitely gets across a lot of the feel of Pit Fighter, especially with the fans flashing the cash in the foreground. Domark didn't need to reinvent the wheel here, and they didn't. As far as the spine goes, Domark put the Pit Fighter name in block letters with orange and red coloring, which is fine and it will stand out on the shelf, but I've got to wonder, why didn't they just put the proper logo here? It would have fit, it's not like there was a space problem. Whatever, at least they were smart enough not to use the same ugly bright yellow block letters that Tengen used for everything. Flipping over the back, and there's a pretty clean layout back here with flavor text from 8 different languages, and for each language there's a handy flag of the nationality for that language. I suppose for those that were wondering which language each language was. Pretty sure Italians don't need to see the flag to know which one's written in Italian, but whatever, it's a nice feature and I like it. The 4 screenshots over to the left are all of decent quality, and each one shows off a different level background, which is nice. In looking at these screenshots before even attempting to play the game, you can see that this Master System version is definitely a unique take on the game, with graphics that appear to be much smaller than you're probably used to if you've played these games on other formats. One final note about the back, Pit Fighter is apparently another one of those later releases where they didn't use the standard information box, but still put the information that you're probably used to seeing there on the back. It's just tied into the bottom of the flavor text, and it looks good. I guess they don't always need to use that format after all. Opening up the case, and both the manual and the cartridge appear barely used. With this being a later third-party release, it's got that white label on the cartridge that American gamers are probably going to be very confused by. As far as the manual goes, it's a traditional PAL manual in landscape format, and it's pretty thin, especially considering it's covering 8 languages. But the thing about Pit Fighter is, even though there's not a ton of information here, I really can't complain that they didn't fully explain the game, because they did. It's just that the game happens to be a relatively simple button mashing brawler. Could have used some more screenshots though, they were pretty stingy on that front. Okay, that's the package. Let's get to the game and see how well this reimagined 8-bit version of Pit Fighter works. Boy, the 80s. What a time to be alive if you liked action movies, especially ones that involved martial arts. Don't get me wrong, Schwarzenegger's great, but the Chuck Norris joke era existed for a reason, and it wasn't necessarily because of Walker, Texas Ranger. It was because of sidekicks. Duh. Anyway, during that time period, if you liked to see fake fights, but pro wrestling wasn't necessarily your thing, Hollywood had you covered. Of course, the major stars were Seagal and Van Damme, with Seagal's speedy and buttery smooth Aikido, and Van Damme's ability to do things with his feet that didn't seem possible. But then there was also Jackie Chan if you needed a bit more comedy, and then lower tier stars like Cynthia Rothrock, Richard Norton, and Don the Dragon Wilson if the action section at Blockbuster was a bit more your thing. The movies that surrounded these stars tended to fall into a few different categories. Frequently, they would be a cop or a cop-adjacent vigilante whose goal was to clean up crime on the streets, with the climax of the film involving taking down some sort of evil crime boss. Does that ring any bells, Streets of Rage fans? But one other subgenre of the martial arts film at the time was the one-on-one combat genre. It could be argued that Stallone's Rocky series really popularized this before the Karate Kid mixed in the martial arts, but either way, there was some sort of tournament or competition involved that was either legal or underground. Van Damme famously popularized this style in 1988 with Bloodsport, involving a colorful cast of combatants all competing in different styles, with plenty of cash on the line for the fans betting on the fights. To take advantage of the popularity of Bloodsport and that one-on-one combat subgenre, Van Damme would make 2 follow-up films, Kickboxer in 1989 and then Lionheart, which was released in August of 1990. Lionheart specifically, and no, I'm not referring to Chris Jericho, centered around the concept of underground cash fights, where two fighters would fight specifically to earn money in a no-holds-barred brawl that were organized by the rich, who wanted a new form of entertainment that had a bit more danger than a traditional organized bout. Personally, I don't love Lionheart, as it's a little formulaic, but it's not a bad action movie if you're good with a ridiculous plot and turning off your brain for 90 minutes. However, the reason why I bring it up is because coincidentally, in August of 1990, Atari released one of their last arcade hits in Pit Fighter. Pit Fighter also had a similar plot of taking a trained fighter and working your way through a series of combatants to earn more and more money. Versus-styled fighting games weren't a wholly new thing in 1990, but it was still very early for that genre of games, which is part of why Pit Fighter was such a success for Atari. For one, think about that time period. While the original Street Fighter had been around since 1987, Street Fighter II was still almost a year away, and all of the Versus games that would make the Neo Geo famous were even further away. Mortal Kombat, a game that clearly derived inspiration from Pit Fighter with its digitized graphics, was over 2 years away, not releasing in the arcades until October of 1992. And perhaps it's not fair to compare Pit Fighter to those games, with Pit Fighter supporting up to 3 players depending on the cabinet, and also including a multi-dimensional play area along with weapons and power-ups. Technically, it could be argued that Pit Fighter resembled something closer to a game like Double Dragon, if it was configured as a boss rush game rather than a side-scrolling beat-em-up. Whatever the case may be, if you were walking into an arcade in late 1990, Pit Fighter was going to grab you, with its digitized real-life looking sprites, character scaling to keep you focused on the action, and potential multiplayer capability. Due to that popularity, of course, Pit Fighter made a great candidate to be ported to home consoles, and it was, making appearances on the various 16-bit consoles and computers of the time. Unfortunately, none of them were very good, as the arcade machine was a beast, and the ports simply didn't translate well to less powerful hardware. Just as an aside, the Genesis version is probably the best of the bunch if you're curious, but I really wouldn't recommend any of them. Anyway, if the 16-bit machines couldn't properly handle Pit Fighter, what possible hope did 8-bit machines have? Well, I think the technical term is not much. But that didn't stop Domark from trying to grab that cash and releasing ports for the Amstrad CPC, ZX Spectrum, and C64, whose only real value is having decent chiptune soundtracks. Seriously, if you want to laugh, go watch a playthrough of either the Amstrad or Spectrum ports. They are both spectacularly awful, even for those consoles. But what about the Master System, seeing as how that's the version we're talking about today? Well, it was handled by Domark as well, but thankfully the Master System is considerably more powerful than those home computers. However, the end result is still a game that only resembles Pit Fighter if you close one eye and squint really hard at the screen. Real quick, before I go any further with the review, if you happen to be like me and have imported the game from Europe and are playing it on an NTSC console, it's gonna have some glitches, especially in level 3 for some reason. Normally, you can just play PAL Master System games on US gear with relatively no issues, other than possibly them running a little bit fast. But that is not the case here. You're gonna notice it. It doesn't break the game, but it does make it a bit ugly. Uglier. If you have a rigid modded console, flip it to PAL and your problems will go away. The lesson is, as always, spend a minute Googling a problem before wasting an hour connecting and disconnecting 3 different consoles to try to figure out what's going on. Okay, back to the review. Pit Fighter, the arcade game, isn't a terribly deep game. You choose from one of 3 fighters: Buzz, a former pro wrestler, Tai, a kickboxer, and Kato, a karate master. Each fighter has a slightly different moveset that's appropriate for their character, and the game gives you 3 buttons to control your character with: a kick button, a punch button, and a jump button. Once you've chosen your fighter, it's time to start working your way up the ladder. There's 10 rounds of fights against 7 opponents. You fight Angel, Southside Jim, and Chainman Eddie twice for some reason, standing in your way between the final showdown with the Masked Warrior, who taunts you occasionally in between fights. To aid you in dethroning that Masked Warrior, you can grab weapons to help you deal out damage, and some crates and barrels have hidden power-ups, which will make the character that grabs them stronger and able to take more damage for a short period of time. Going after those is always a gamble because if your opponent grabs the power-up instead of you, it could be a very short fight. Depending on how well you do in your fights, you'll earn a winning purse and bonuses on each of your wins, and after every 2 fights, you'll compete in a grudge bonus match against a mirror of yourself to attempt to earn more money, and of course, the amount of money you earn in the end will get you on the high score table. Now, everything I just discussed is for the arcade version of Pit Fighter. How much of that was Domark able to cram into the Master System version? Honestly, most of it, as the main structure of the game remains unchanged, with the concessions largely coming from the graphics. As far as the controls go, you can immediately see a problem for the Master System controller here, with it only having 2 buttons instead of 3. However, it's not that big an issue, as the jumping function has been tied to holding up on the D-pad while pressing either button, with one producing a plain jump and the other a jump kick. I'm not exactly sure why you'd want to just jump, but whatever, it's there as an option. As you're probably not surprised to hear, any version of Pit Fighter can be a bit of a button masher, with players hammering buttons to try to get attacks in before their opponent. Conveniently, the Master System version is set up understanding this, and rather than needing to rapidly press buttons or use a rapid-fire controller, you can simply hold down on the punch or kick buttons. This isn't always useful, just due to the way that combat works, with the computer frequently being able to get in hits if you're just spamming attacks, but it's certainly a nice feature to have. I should probably clarify that last statement regarding combat working. Fighting in Pit Fighter, even in the original arcade game, can be a bit rough, and unfortunately, things have gotten worse in the port to the Master System. One problem is the downed attacks. You're supposed to be able to knock down an opponent after a few hits, and then attack them on the ground while they're prone. Well, you can still knock them down, but in this version, for some reason those downed attacks never seem to make contact, even though they're animated. Then there's the weapons. Picking up a weapon in-game is a chore. You have to be standing just right, and then hold down and button 1 to pick it up. But frequently, you're just going to stand there like an idiot because you're not lined up correctly. And to add insult to injury, the barrels and crates that are in the game don't work like they do in the arcade. If you pick up one of them, you're locked in place, rather than being able to move around and target your enemy. So you better hope that when you picked one of them up, your opponent was standing right in front of you. Also, this makes trying to get one of the power-ups a huge pain, as you have to break the crate or barrel they're in hitting your opponent. And if you happen to line up the shot correctly, frequently your opponent will be closer to the power-up when it pops out, putting you in a worse situation than when you started. As far as the graphics go, well, they're something. I mean, you've been watching this video, you can see how it looks. The characters have been shrunk down so far that they look almost super deformed in nature, and all the weapons look extremely crude. Anything that made the arcade version impressive from a graphics standpoint is gone. And yet, knowing that this is a Master System title and that this game was crammed into 4 megabits, I don't hate it. It certainly looks far better than on any of the other 8-bit systems that got ports of the game, but as referenced earlier, that's not exactly saying much. I suppose at very least it still evokes the idea of Pit Fighter, even at a much lower fidelity. As opposed to the graphics, the sound was actually a very nice surprise, or at least the soundtrack was. I couldn't find much about them on the internet, but apparently the music in game comes to us courtesy of the Doomsday Machine. I'm going to assume they were a chiptune collective in the UK at the time, but I do find it interesting that I can't find any other game credits for them, as clearly they had talent. While there's no music during the fights, the rest of the game sounds great, and is more than likely better than you would be expecting out of the base Master System PSG chip. Between the futzing around with trying to figure out why the game wasn't acting right originally, and the experimenting with scanlines that you may have noticed in the game footage, I spent way longer with Pit Fighter than I ever expected to. In fact, there's a distinct possibility that I spent more time with the Master System version than I did with the Genesis version back in episode 85. But after all that time, I started to think, do I like this version better than the Genesis version? It sounds crazy to say, but remember that the Genesis version is an ugly looking port of an arcade game that has not aged well. And the Master System version has great music and an interesting 2-player mode where you can control the other fighters in the game besides the main 3. That's something I don't think you can do in any other version, at least to my knowledge. But then I thought back to how broken the weapon system is, and the fact that I was really only successful due to playing in easy and cheesing the jump kicks, and yeah, it's still not great. As a result, I'm giving Pit Fighter for the Master System 1 star, just like the Genesis version. But I've got to be honest, if I had to choose between those two, I'm honestly not sure which one I would pick. I'd just pray that if ever came to that, I'd have some sort of third option.
And that was Pit Fighter for the Master System. This is a week when I really appreciated the fact that I went through the trouble of getting my Genesis region modded, as it gave me the option to play Pit Fighter properly and not have to put up with those weird graphical errors that were popping up. It was playable in NTSC mode, don't get me wrong, but it was odd, and the music definitely sounded better slowed down. And I had fun finally getting to use the scanline profiles of the RetroTink 5X. There's a good chance I'm going to be using the one I picked going forward for playing games, but I do know that they're not for everyone. So let me know in the comments below if I should keep recording the gameplay with the scanline profile on, or turn it back off and go the way it was before. Next week on Zilog and Moto, it's another game in EA's short-lived Air Force series of games on the Genesis. Previously, I reviewed F-22 Interceptor as part of that series, and I ended up liking it way more than I expected to, even though the graphics looked absolutely primitive due to the Genesis inability to handle 3D polygonal graphics. I'm assuming that this game is probably going to be more of the same, so who knows? Hopefully I'll have fun with it too, but Star Fox, this is not. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 186. If you like what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you are so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later.